Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome to FX Maniac. This is Syed Mahmoud Amiri and welcome to the Maya NParticles basics tutorial. And in this tutorial we'll basically be taking a look at the NParticles or the particle system inside of Maya, the basics, and we'll do some examples. And if you stick till the end, I'm going to be showing you guys how to create this really cool effect using the particle systems. It's basically an image, but you can render video also. So this is going to be our final product for this tutorial, and yeah, after we do the basics. And before we get started, I just wanted to take the time and thank you everyone, and say thank you to everyone who basically commented and like appreciated this last tutorial, and it's got like 1K view, which for me is of course a milestone, and I'm so grateful for it. So yeah, we'll get started on this, and I promise to do a lot more. So okay, first things first, I am going to assume that you know the basics of Maya, okay? And I'm also going to assume that you have zero knowledge about NParticles, and this is going to be a complete beginner tutorial. So first things first, if you want to get into the particle or the dynamic section of Maya, you have to go click here in the modeling submenu and click on effects, and here you'll get the NParticles and cloth and hair and all these things. So we're going to be taking a look at the NParticles, and as you can see in this menu there's a lot of different options, but the thing that we're going to be taking a look at is first create an emitter. And the other thing is we have two types of particles. We have the legacy particles, which are kind of old from the old version of Maya, and we have the NParticles, which is the new one. So we're going to be taking a look at the NParticles, which is more advanced. So first thing, if I create on this create emitter, like the box, the right side of it, we can name it like any name you want, like particles or whatever. And the solver, of course you want to create a new solver because we don't have it, or if you have a previous solver you can just click and select it, and this new particle will also act according to that solver, which we'll get into in a moment. So, and here's the type of the particles. You can create an omni, directional, and a volume, which we can change later. So for now I'm going to choose omni, and how many particles per second you want. So I'm just going to change it to like 600 particles per second, and you can change the speed and all later also. So I'll just hit create, and as you can see, if I hit play, the particles will just start to, you know, fall down because of the gravity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the outliner, and here is the particle 2, which we named it, which is the emitter. So I can just move it up, and in order to see the changes, every time you have to go to the first frame and then play, so then you'll see the changes that's happening to the particles. We can also rename them to like emitter or whatever you want. So yeah. And the other thing is, if I select these particles and I hit Ctrl A to go to the attribute editor, we can see that if I select the particles in the NParticle shape 1, we have a lot of settings, okay, which we're going to be taking a look at the most important ones. And if you wanted to like some specific things, we can take a look at that in a different tutorial. But for now, basically these particles are falling down because of gravity, and gravity is in this nucleus solver, okay? It's 9.8, and because of that the particles are falling down. If I set this to 0, there won't be any gravity, and the particles will just be moving by their own speed, okay? So I'm going to set it back to 9.8, and I'm going to go back to the particle. Here's the particle system, and here's the emitter, which is basically the settings that we created is there, the amount, and then we have directional particles, which you can specify to a direction. Like I can just set the direction to maybe x1, and if you increase the speed, the particles will basically shoot out in that direction, right? And the other thing is you get this kind of warning if I go to the time settings. Make sure every time that you're using the particle system, this playback speed is set to play every frame, because it needs to calculate all those, especially when the simulation gets heavy. So you need to basically set this to play every frame so that it gets the right time to calculate all the things that are happening to the particles. If it is 24 frames per second, of course it'll play in real time, but sometimes it's going to skip while trying to, you know, play it in real time. So make sure it's on play every frame and save. And I want now to be omni, and These other options we're going to be taking a look at, but for now I'm going to set it to Omni, so it's going to generate in this sort of a fashion. But the speed is a bit too much, so I'm going to drag it down back to like 1.8. Now you can see the particles are there. So this is a very basic particle system. And what if I wanted to change the shape of the particle? So I'm going to go into the NParticle 1, and here in the shading tab, now they're set to points. So I'm going to change it to, we have these different shapes, multi-streak, we have numerics, and we have these other options, but mostly we're going to be using the point and the spheres. The spheres are basically these sphere objects that we can use, and yeah, now the shape is going to be the sphere, and we can change the size using the particle size. But the problem is, right now these particles are not colliding with each other. In other words, there's no such thing as inner particle collision, which we can set. If we go into this collisions tab, there's this thing called collide, which is basically colliding with other objects, and this self collide is basically setting the particles to collide with themselves. So I'm going to go back to the first frame, and I'm going to start playing, and now you can see that the particles are basically colliding with each other too. So this is it, and now I want the particles to collide with this floor also. You can create an object, maybe like a plane, and scale it up, or any other object, and set it as a passive collider. Now the particles will basically collide with that object, but once they get off of that surface, they'll still go down. So what I'm going to do is delete this, and I'm going to go into the nucleus, and I'm going to this option called ground plane and use plane. So now this grid is basically is going to act as an infinite plane. So if you play it, the particles will just get like, keep moving and colliding with each other until like the time finishes. So basically this is how the self collision and the ground collision works inside these particles. And now what I'm gonna do is, maybe I want to randomize the size of these particles. So I'm gonna go back to the NParticle 1, go into the particle size. Here we can change the size, make it small or big, but there's no option as like randomness. So what we can do is, here's the radius scale, and we have a graph, like we can change it. So I can do like this, or maybe I can add like different points to it, and maybe one up, one down, basically like this, kind of like this graph. But still, if I play this back, you see no changes, because we need to set the radius scale input to randomized ID. So now you can see some particles are really small, some of them are really big, and if I just play this back, you can see that they're still colliding, but there is a variation into the particles. So if I change them, you can see that there are some certain variations in these particles. Okay, so that's it. Now how about if we want to change the color? So I'm going to go back to the shading tab, and I'm going to click I'm going to go down, and here's the color. So same thing, I can add multiple colors, or I can just go with one color, maybe like blue, right? But what if I want it to be different colors? So I added, by clicking here, you can add a color palette and double click, or just click here and pick a maybe like an orange color, and then the next one too. I'll just delete this, Control Z, just click on this little X, and it'll just remove the color palette, and I'll just click here and maybe make this like green, and this one too, like maybe any other color, any color that you want. So now we've changed the color, but we don't see the changes, and basically we need to change this color input to randomized ID. And now you see we have all these different color particles, which are really looking kind of cool, So yeah, these are the basic settings for the particle system. Now what I'm going to do is, I'm just going to, there's a lot of different settings. Okay, if you wanted to, I can do another separate tutorial for it, but for now we're going to go and we'll experience with some forces. I'm going to select this particle system, and here we have the fields and solvers, which are like the external forces that is going to affect the particles. So I'm going to add a turbulence like this. Now you can see it doesn't have a lot of effect because it's less, so I'm going to increase it. Now if I see, you can see that the particles are kind of moving in a turbulent sort of motion. If I increase this to like 300, now you're gonna see the effect very clearly, like this. And we have some other forces too. Like if I select this, make sure you're selecting the particle system and then going to add the force, because otherwise it won't work. So I'm gonna go to the vortex and increase it to like 100. Now you can see that the particles are like moving in a vortex way. And the other thing is, now we need, like if you want to, you can go to emitter and increase the number of particles to maybe like 5,000. And now if I play this back, you can see that we have this huge, maybe it's a little too much, so I'll go for like 2,000. Huge simulation of particles which are just doing a bunch of wild stuff, and it's looking pretty cool. Alright, so yeah, that's basically how you use forces and all these things. And if you want the particles to die at a certain age, you can just go into the lifespan, and here's like live forever, because it's just gonna live forever. So we can change it to constant or random range. Constant is basically like if we set 1 here, it's going to be like 24 frames. So if I play this back, after 24 frames the particles are gonna die, because 1 second is necessarily 24 frames here, right? If you see here. And the other thing is, like if I change this to random, we can change it to be like 2 seconds, but still 1 second randomness. So it's going to be they're not going to die at the same time necessarily. Some will die soon, some will die later. Okay, so yeah, this is also very useful, because you don't want the particles to go too far and still get calculated. It's going to make the system a bit more a bit more fast and effective. So yeah, this is it basically. So now I'm going to give you a very small example. So I'm going to create a new scene, and in this scene I'm just going to go and create a new sphere, so like this. And by the way, to create a sphere, just hold down shift and right click. Here's the sphere. So I just did it like quickly. So yeah, delete it and then just create a new one. And I'm just going to go and right click on the faces. I'm going to go into maybe one of the side views, and I'm going to select half of the shape and I'm going to delete it. And in order to give it thickness, I'm just going to hit Control E to go to poly extrude and just give it a bit of a thickness, maybe this much. And I want the particles to fill this shape. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to NParticles, and you can emit particles off of an object too. Okay, so I'm gonna create a new sphere, and I'm going to basically move it up and scale it down, and I want the particles to emit from this object. So I'm gonna go into NParticles, emit from object. There's Omni and there's going to be surface. So Omni is basically gonna select, like, emit particles from the whole volume of the object, and surface is going to be emitting particles from the surface. Okay, and this curve option, I think we have covered it in this tutorial, and the portal effect, which we necessarily emit particles from a circle, which is a curve. So you can check this tutorial out for more info, but for now we're going to set it to surface and 600 for now and create. So now, as you can see, these particles are coming down, and we need to set this object as a collider. So I'm going to select the object and I'm going to go into the N cloth, and I'm going to set it to passive collider. So now the particles are basically going to collide with this object, and we need to change the shape of these to spheres. So I'm going to go to shading, and I'm going to go to spheres, and we need to turn on the self collide so that they collide with each other, and now you can see that they're there. So I basically want to fill this up, this shape up, and once it's filled, I don't want any more particles. So what I'm going to do is change this to maybe like 300 frames, and I'm going to increase this time slider, and let's see, maybe here I just want no more particles to be born. So I'm just going to go into the emitter here, and here's the particles per second. So I'm going to go right click, set key, and I'm going to move a few frames forward, and I'm going to set it to 0. And I'm going to right click again, set key. So now if I play this back, you can see that there's no more particles born. A few of them just go down, which we don't want to, so we may as well want these keyframes. Hold down shift and select them and move them a bit back so that we don't get a lot of particles not necessarily that they overflow, which they still do, so maybe a bit more. And this time I think they're not gonna overflow because they're simply maybe one more. So I'm just gonna move it one, and yeah, this time for sure they're not gonna overflow, right? Yeah. Okay, so what I want is these particles to settle down and to a state where they're like, you know, not moving or barely moving, maybe here. And I want this to be the initial state of these particles. Like if we even reset, they're going to be like this. They're going to start from here. So what I'm going to do is select these particles, go into the fields and solvers, and there's an option called initial state. So I'm going to set for selected. Now if I go back, you can see that the particles start from that state, but there's still new particles to be born, right? We don't want that. So I'm gonna select this particle, this one, and I'm going to delete it because we don't need it. Okay, so now we're just left with these particles, and I want to animate this this pot or whatever it is. So first off, we need the anchor point to be in the middle, so I'm gonna go into modify and center pivot, and I'm just gonna go like maybe from 70 frames. I'm just gonna go to the sphere, like if I select it and go here, and for the translate I'm gonna set a key, and for the rotate I'm gonna set a key. So I'm gonna go like till 104 frames. I'm gonna select this, move it up and rotate it like this, and then we'll go back and we'll set a key again. We haven't set the key. Control set. I'm gonna go Control A to the channel editor, and I'm going to keyframe all these keys selected, and I'm gonna go to like 40 frames, and I'm going to move this up. Control Z because there's something happened. We changed the anchor point, right? So yeah, that's what happened. So I'm gonna go with modify center pivot, and I'm gonna go back. Now you can see that the particles are there. So from like 90 frame, I'm going to keyframe all of these, right click, key selected, go to like 130 frames, and move this up and just rotate it like this, like wild, and then right click, set key again, or key selected, and then I'm gonna go back and I'm going to rotate this again like this side, and maybe move it up and this much, right? And I'm going to set key or key selected again. So now let's see what's gonna happen. I'm going to zoom out a bit and play this back. So they're all fine, and then from 100 frames they just get like, you know, dropped off, which is good. But the thing is, the particles are going through the floor, which we don't want that, because they're gonna go like forever to eternity. So we want them to touch this floor and like stay on the floor. So as we did before, going to the nucleus, Control A to the attribute editor, and I'm gonna go use plane. So now as you can see, they are just on the floor, they're colliding with each other, and they create this, like, they react to the movement of the object. Okay, so yeah, this is a very basic example, but you can do a lot of things with it, and I'm sure you got the basic idea of how to work with it. So now I think is the time for this example that we've done. So here is basically the raw render that we have done. Okay, and I'm going to recreate this in NParticles, and I'm going to do it quick because we've already covered the basics, and it is going to be very long if we do that again. So I'm going to try to do is a bit quicker. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to create a new scene, and what I did to emit the particles, I basically emitted the particles from a sphere. So I'm going to create a sphere and scale it up, maybe a bit less, and I'll move it up. And I want the particles to be born from the sphere. So I'm going to go into NParticles, emit from object, and surface. Maybe I want 1500 particles for now, which will definitely increase in like later, but for now it's fine. I don't want the gravity to affect the particles, so instead of going and like zeroing out the gravity, there is an option in the NParticles settings in the dynamic properties which is called ignore solver gravity, which they will no longer be affected by the solver's gravity. Okay, so that's it. And now I'm going to select these particles, and I'm going to add one turbulence field, and we can change this name to like turbulence. Okay, and I'm going to set the magnitude to like 150 so that we can see how crazy this is, like this much. But I think it's a bit too crazy. Okay, so I'm gonna increase the attenuation to like 3, and let's see what happens now. They're not that crazy right now, and I want these particles to be affected in a very specific area. Okay, so I'm gonna go into the volume controls, and I want it to be a sphere. So if I hit, like, select the sphere and hit H to hide it, so it creates a spherical sort of field, which I can scale it up, and only that area is going to be, that area of the particles, if the particles are within that area, it's going to be affected. If not, then they're not going to be affected, right? You can see that. So what I'm going to do is just make sure that the areas that we want are basically affected by that, and I may want to increase the magnitude to like 350 so that they get a bit like crazy sort of emotion. And the other thing is, I'm just going to select the particles again, and I'm going to add a vortex, and I'll increase that also to like 100, which is a bit too much. And I'm going to increase the attenuation for this one too, like to 3, like this. And I definitely want a lot more particles, so I'm gonna go into the emitter here, and I'm gonna make it like 5,000 per second. And let's see here, yeah. So now this is basically our simulation here, this scene. Now it's all about getting this look, this yellow and orange and this shape. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to create a new plane, and I'm gonna increase the size of this, and I want to make sure that the particles collide with this. So I'm going to go to NCloth and create a passive collider, and which is not a good idea. So I'm just going to take this sphere, hit H again, and I'll like move it up a bit, and then the spherical field too, because if it is too close to the ground, then they're gonna like bounce off. So we don't need that. We basically want like this. And I need to create some lights, okay, some Arnold lights. So I'm gonna hide this again. So I'm gonna go Arnold lights, area light, hit 7, and increase the shape, the size of this, and it's from this side. So I may rotate this and add it from this side. Maybe increase the intensity to like 10 and the exposure to 6, and I'll move this up again like this. I'll change the color to orange, which is basically in the example, not too much of an orange, but this, like this much. But now if you render this using the Arnold render view, you can see that the particles are there, but they're very small, right? So what I'm going to do is I'll go into the NParticle, and in the Arnold tab, here is the radius. So I can just increase this to like 4, and I can play this back. So now you can see that we got like 4 times more bigger particles than the usual, and they're looking pretty cool actually. You know, we may want to increase the intensity of our light, maybe to like 8, but the thing is they're looking already pretty cool. And the other thing is I just need to duplicate this light and to this side and change the color. So I'm gonna go into the area light, Control D, and just I want to like flip it, right? So I'll just rotate this to like this maybe. I'll change the color to like blue, not too much of a vibrant blue, but like this. And I need to zoom in and go check it out one more time. Arnold render view, and as you can see, it's already looking pretty cool. And we just need to like give it a bit of time just to look a bit more better. But I think this blue is a bit too bluish, so I'm gonna reduce it to more of like white. And the other thing is that in this scene we have a lot of if I show you the raw render so you can see it clearly, is the thing is that we have motion blur too. So, or maybe we need to increase the size of the particles too a bit. So I'm gonna go into the particles, and I'm going to go into the Arnold, maybe 5, and I'm going to increase this one more time, which is looking pretty cool. Yeah, and I may need to zoom out a bit so that we can see everything in the frame like this. And what I'll do is I will go to this light, and maybe I'll increase this even more to like 10, so it's a bit more bright, not necessarily that much, maybe 9. It's all about like testing it. And then if you want the shadow quality, like these noise, to be gone, you can just go to the samples of the shadow, make it like 3, and I'll select the first light also, and I'll make it 3. And the other thing is that we need to turn on motion blur. Okay, so I'm gonna go into the render settings, and I'll go into the Arnold, and I'm going to the motion blur, enable it, and I'm gonna set the length to 1 because I want this to have like a very good motion blur. And I'm gonna set the camera AA to 4 and the diffuse to 3. Again, this is not a lighting tutorial, so I'm just putting some random numbers. And I'm gonna change the size to maybe HD 720p, and I'm gonna click render. So let's see how this will look. So as you can see, the render is done. It took like 44 seconds for this frame, which is really fast, and it's already looking pretty cool. You know, just the detail and these different levels of colors, and we can just do some basic like color correction inside this. So what I'm gonna do is just give it a bit of a contrast, which is already looking pretty cool. So yeah, this is basically the effect. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take another render of this, and I'm going to show you guys how to composite it inside of After Effects. So what I'm going to do is I may want to increase this intensity for the first light a bit more to like 9, and increase the shadow samples on the second light or the first light to like 4, in this one 2, 4, and I may want to go and pick a different frame, maybe this one, and I'm gonna go take a 1080p render, and yeah, and I'll just click on render, and I'll be back when it's done. Alright, so our render is done. It took like 2 minutes and 7 seconds, but as you can see, it is definitely worth it, and it's looking really cool. And I just want to save it now, so I'm going to go to File, and before clicking on the save, I'm just going to go to the box and make sure this color managed image is checked, and apply and close. Now I'm just going to click on this, and I'm going to save this here to maybe like particles render. And if you want a PNG, you can save it as a PNG, but in this case I'm just going to save it as a JPEG and save. And I'm going to go into After Effects. So in After Effects, I'm just going to double click and bring this particles render, import, and I'm just going to create a new composition out of this, which is this one. First I want to give it a bit of a contrast, so go into color correction, curves, and I'm just going to make it like create an S curve like this. And the second thing is I want to give it a glow, so I'm just going to go stylize and glow, and maybe I don't want all the areas to have glow, so I'm just going to increase this threshold so that we have a glow on some very like bright areas, but still it's looking pretty cool. And in this example, I've used an optical flare, and I've used a trap code shine on top of it, so I can just like copy this, or I can just create a new adjustment layer and use the RG trap code shine, which if you don't have it is completely fine. You can change the color to maybe like electric, and decrease the rail length, and even the shine opacity, you know, which may be a bit too much. Not the source opacity, shine opacity, like this. And yeah, this is the end result. And I know this tutorial was a bit long, but I just wanted to cover like everything that we've said, and I know we're barely scratching the surface of NParticles. And yeah, it's all upon you. Just follow up with the tutorial, and if you have any questions or you want me to do another tutorial touching on some other areas of NParticles, you can just go to the channel. And by the way, here's the channel, right? And here is my Instagram account, Effects with Sayed, which you can basically click on this little Instagram account, and it'll just take you here. You can check my works. This is me, by the way, if you haven't seen. You can comment here. You can, if you have any suggestions, any questions, any thing you want for the next tutorial, you can just comment here or in the channel, or any questions you have, you can just comment them here. And yeah, as always, I really appreciate you guys, watching these tutorials and commenting on them, and it matters a lot to me, and that's what motivates me to keep going. Okay, so yeah, keep doing it, and as always, till next time, enjoy working.